In this portion of the book of Job, Jehovah finally speaks up and speaks for himself. He doesn't try to answer Job's questions of him. Instead, he asks Job a series of questions himself. Let's open up the Bible and think on these things. This is the Word of Truth Ministry video library. I am Nathan C. Johnson, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. Let's open our Bibles to the book of Job, chapter 38. And here, after the long arguments between Job and his three friends, and then, as we saw, the mediation of the fourth friend, Elihu, we now come upon the portion of the book of Job that perhaps we've been waiting for finally. Jehovah himself speaks up. And in many ways, I can't help but compare this to the day we live in today, the dispensation of grace. Because the fact is that God is silent today. God keeps silent. And yet human beings do not. Many human beings speak against God. Many human beings mock God. And they say, if there's really a God, let him speak up and answer me. And we wait for the day when Psalm 74 and verse 22 takes place, where the psalmist writes, "Arise," meaning go into action. "Arise, O God, plead thine own cause. Remember how the foolish man reproacheth thee daily." And remember, in the Bible, the foolish are not those who are mentally deficient. It's those who are morally deficient. And yes, morally deficient ones reproach the true God daily, constantly. And we wait for that time when God will go into action and plead his own cause. And we've sort of been waiting for that throughout the book of Job. 37 chapters we've had of God not speaking for himself. And yet now, finally, God does. At this time, God had not yet fallen silent. It wasn't yet the dispensation of grace when God is always silent. And so God finally spoke up and answered for himself. And we'll see what he had to say here in Job chapter 38. Where we read in verse 1, and once again I'm reading from Bullinger's metrical translation, a very excellent translation of Job. 38:1, "Then from the storm Jehovah spake to Job." So he speaks from the storm. The King James Version calls it a whirlwind. But really it was a storm. And perhaps, as we saw at the end of Elihu's speech in the last chapter, he refers to a storm at the end of his speech. So perhaps it was brewing. It was stirring up. The clouds were coming in, and the storm was coming from which Jehovah was going to speak. And Elihu mentioned the storm at the end of his address. But at any rate, now Jehovah speaks to Job from the storm. Verse 2, "Pray, who is it that maketh counsel dark, by words devoid of knowledge and of truth?" Now notice that Jehovah speaks up and he's speaking to Job. Verse 1 tells us that he's speaking to Job. And yet here, the first thing he says is he's talking as if to himself about Job. And he's asking, perhaps asking those who are listening. We know that Job and his friends all had an audience, as we've seen. But he says, who is it who makes counsel dark? In other words, he means Job. Job is darkening counsel by words devoid of knowledge. We would say Job doesn't know what he's talking about. So Jehovah accuses Job of that here. Verse 3, "Gird up thy loins now like a man, for I will ask of thee, and do thou answer me." So he asks him to gird up his loins. Now understand, back then the men all wore robes. And robes can be very convenient, very cool in hot climate like they had in the Middle East there. But when you want to work, those robes can dangle and get in your way. So what you do is, if you've got the robe, you would reach down, grab the bottom of the robe, and you'd pull it up, and then you'd tie it up, and it would form kind of almost a pair of shorts, and then you would be much more able to work, much more free to move without those robes dangling there. And that was called girding up your loins, and it was basically preparing to do work. So he says to him, gird up your loins now like a man. And the Hebrew there is gaber, which is the strong man. Gird up your loins like a strong man. For I will ask of thee, and do thou answer me. So he says, prepare yourself to work to answer me. He says, I'm going to ask you questions, and I'm going to wait for your answer. So once again, Jehovah is not going to answer Job's questions and Job's accusations of him. God, you are unfair to me. I didn't do anything wrong, and you caused all this calamity. Why are you unfair? He's not going to answer his questions. Instead, he's going to ask him questions and see if he can answer. And what follows is a series of questions. And I don't think Jehovah waits for an answer until after he's done with a whole series of questions. But these questions are really questions that are to teach. Questions that are to inform. He says, wherefore, where wast thou when I earth's foundations laid? Say if thou knowest, and hast intelligence. So he asked Job, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? And the Hebrew there is eretz, E-R-E-T-S. And it's the word that could be translated earth, but it could also be translated land. So he could be talking about the earth, or he could be talking about the dry land. So he says, where were you when I laid the foundation of eretz? Say if you know and have intelligence of it. Well, of course, the reality is that Job wasn't there. He wasn't born yet. In fact, no one was born yet. Jehovah hadn't created Adam, the first member of the human race, who was created, of course, as an adult. And no one was there. So Jehovah laid the earth's foundations alone. No human being helped him. Verse 5, who fixed its measurements? For thou wilt know. Or who upon it stretched the measuring line? So he asked, who fixed the measurements of the land? Who decided just how long and how wide and how deep the dry land would be? He says, for thou wilt know, for you'll know surely. And there's no doubt about it here that Jehovah is using figures of speech, Hebrew figures of speech, in speaking with Job. First of all, he's using erotasis, and that means interrogating. In other words, he's questioning Job not for an answer, but for another reason. That's erotasis. In this case, the reason is to demonstrate to Job the truth of the superiority of Jehovah to any human being, any member of Adam's race like Job. But he's also using the figure here, irony. Speaking, we would say sarcasm. Surely you'll know who fixed its measurements. You must have been there. You're so wise. You think you could argue with God and win. Well, anyone that wise must have been there when I was making the foundations of the earth, when I was measuring it out. You must have been there and watched. That's the only reason you would think you were smart enough to outsmart me. Or who stretched upon it the measuring line? Who measured how large the earth would be? Well, Jehovah decided how large the earth would be. I don't know that he literally used a measuring line. He didn't need to. But however it was that he measured it and decided its dimensions. Verse 6, on what were its foundations made to rest? Or who its cornerstone so truly laid? And what were its foundations made to rest? Of course, we know that the foundations of the land rest on what's under the crust. And we've been able to detect some of that, the mantle and all that sort of thing, by certain means of trying to examine the center of the earth. But really, I don't know that anybody's been way down there to actually see it. A better translation could also be, on what were its sockets or its pillars settled? On what was it really set up, this dry land? Or who poured its cornerstone? Now, a cornerstone is the stone from which you make all the other measurements. You set that one stone, and then you make all the other measurements off that stone. So he said, who laid the cornerstone, which allowed him to make all the rest of the measurements for the earth? Who did that? Of course, Job doesn't know. Of course, he wasn't there. Verse 7, when all the morning stars together sang, and all the sons of God did shout for joy. So note that these morning stars he mentioned are the sons of God. Now we saw back in Job chapters 1 through 2, the sons of God coming to present themselves before the Lord's throne. And we suggested there that the sons of God are angels, and particularly the ruling angels, the ones who have power and authority, and the heavenly beings. Could include cherubs. Satan was among them, apparently. He was one of the sons of God, the heavenly beings, although he fell. And some of the other sons of God probably fell as well and weren't sons of God anymore. Now notice that the sons of God were there when he laid the foundations of the earth. And I've used some people to try to use this verse to prove to me the gap theory. What's the gap theory? Well, it's the idea that in Genesis 1:1, when it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And then in verse 1:2, "The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." That, well, God wouldn't have created the earth without form and void, so there must have been an original creation. And then Satan fell and destroyed that original creation, and then Genesis 1:2 and on describes a recreation. Now, I know that the founder of the Word of Truth Ministry, Otis Q, believed this, as did many of the Bible students of his time. I don't believe this. I don't believe this is true. I think it's a huge stretch. I think it's a mountain based on molehills of passages that don't at all really say what they're supposed to say to bring forth this gap. But they say the angels were there when God laid the foundation of the earth. So they were already there on day one. So they must have been part of an original creation if they were there on day one of the 6 days of creation. Well, I would point out that, again, the word eretz can mean earth or land. And I think he's talking about measuring out the land, the dry land. He's talking about day 3. He's not talking about day 1. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And there couldn't be any angels before the beginning. Now, I believe they were there on day 3. And they were probably created on day 2 when God created the firmament, the heavens. He probably created the angels at the same time, so they were there on day 3 to sing together as he was laying the foundations of the dry land. Not of the planet the earth. That was there in the beginning. He made it instantly as at the beginning. Verse 8. "Or who fenced in with doors the roaring sea? When bursting forth from nature's womb it came." So he says, who decided where the sea would be? What the boundaries would be? What the shoreline would be? That's, of course, how the sea is fenced in, by the shoreline. When bursting forth from nature's womb it came. Well, of course, Jehovah means if you were there, you know who did this since you watched it happening. And surely you must have watched it happening if you're so wise you think you can argue with me. Well, of course, Job wasn't there, and he didn't watch. Verse 9. "What time I made the clouds its covering robe, and darkness deep the swaddling band thereof." Now, a swaddling band was something an infant was wrapped in. He was wrapped round and round and round, kind of like a mummy, with a swaddling band. And he says that I made the sea when I originally made it. I made the clouds like the robe covering it, and darkness like the swaddling band wrapping it. Well, of course, that's poetry. Job is a book of poetry. These are poetic images, and they picturesquely describe the creation of the sea in darkness. Remember, God moved upon the face of the deep, the face of the sea. When God created the earth, it was covered by water. And he didn't make the dry land appear till day 3. And it was covered by darkness. Of course, he created the earth. He created the earth in the beginning. Boom, it was there. When time began, the earth began too. But he didn't create the light till after that. So clouds were covering it, and darkness was swaddling it. Verse 9, "When I decreed for it my boundary, and set its bars and doors, and to it said." So he says, I decreed the boundary of the sea when I made it. And of course, he made it, ultimately covering the whole earth, but then he created boundaries for it when he caused the dry land to rise up and appear. And that was its bars and doors, deciding where the water would be and where it wouldn't. And he said to it, verse 11, "Thus far, no farther, ocean, shalt thou come. Here shalt thou stay the swelling of thy waves." So this is a question. Who did this? he asked Job, and then he claims that he did it, of course. I did it. And were you there to watch me do it? Were you there to watch me create the dry land and set the boundaries of the sea? Tell the ocean where its waves would stop. Were you there watching when I did this? Verse 12. Hast thou called morning forth since thou wast born, or taught the early dawn to know its place? So have you called forth morning since it was born? In other words, morning by morning, who calls the morning forth? Who causes the sun to rise? And of course, it's Jehovah who decides when the sun should rise. And it's Jehovah who sets its path through the sky. He decided where it should travel. Now, he proved this. He proved this in the past. For example, when Israel was fighting their enemies and Jehovah was fighting on their side, and he commanded the sun to stand still. And it stayed still in the sky for about 12 hours so that they could defeat their enemies and didn't have to stop when the sun set. And then, of course, in the days of Hezekiah, Jehovah, the one who's in complete charge of the sun, said to Hezekiah, of course, Hezekiah was sick, and he told him, Hezekiah, set your house in order. Get everything prepared for you to die, because you're going to die and not live. And then the prophet Isaiah left. He was going out, and Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and said, Oh, Lord, remember how I've served you faithfully my whole life. And he started to cry. And Jehovah heard his words and saw his tears, and he said to Isaiah, Isaiah, go back. And he came back and said, Hezekiah, you're going to live and not die. Hezekiah said, wait a minute. First time you said die and not live. This time you said live and not die. Which one's right? How do I know I'm going to live and not die? And Jehovah said, well, here's the deal. You can watch out your window the sundial of Ahaz, and you watch the shadow move around it. What do you want that shadow to do? Move 10 degrees forward or 10 degrees backward? Now see, for Jehovah it made a little difference. He knows that he is the one moving the sun. Now, of course, in our way of thinking, we say that the earth spins, and that's why the sun moves through the sky. But I think the Lord very much understands Einstein's theory of relativity and, things from your standpoint, from your context, from the context of the earth. Of course, the sun moves through the sky. And this is our frame of reference, of course. From our frame of reference, he's the one who makes the sun move through the sky. If you want to insist on it, of course, he's the one who makes the earth spin. And he's the one who causes it to keep spinning forward, and he could just easily make it spin backwards. They say, well, the force, as the earth came to a stop and then moved backwards, why would just cause everything to fly off the earth? No, it wouldn't. Not if Jehovah just instantly reversed the force and cause there to be no momentum, just instantly switch momentum 180 degrees. And he can do that. Of course, no human being could, but he could do that. So he asked Hezekiah, do you want the sun to keep going forward or do you want it to go backward? Hezekiah said, it's nothing for it to keep going forward. It always does that. Make it go backward. But see, Jehovah is the one who's always making it go forward. It takes just as much power for him to keep the laws of nature going the way they are as for him to reverse them. See, that's the thing. All these who try to come up with naturalistic explanations, how just the laws of nature could have created everything. Well, but where did those laws come from? Who enforces them? Who makes the stone drop every time you drop it? Who makes those things happen? The Lord. You see? So for him, it was just as much his power if the sun went forward as if it went backward. But Hezekiah, of course, he wanted it to go backward. And Jehovah could do that because he's the one who moves the sun or spins the earth, however you want to look at it. But of course, Job didn't do that. Job hadn't brought the morning forth since he was born. He hadn't taught the dawn to know its place, where the sun should rise. Verse 13, bid morn lay hold on outskirts of the earth. Taught dawn to rout the lawless from their place. So dawn lays hold on the outskirts of the earth. Of course, dawn starts way out there in the east, and then it spreads across the whole earth. So it lays hold on the outskirts, the far east of the land first. Earth is Eretz again, and it could be the land. And then it taught dawn to rout the lawless from their place. And of course, the sun chases the lawless people underground. Of course, they come out at night to practice their lawless deeds under cover of darkness. But who causes the sun to rise and chase them back into hiding? Well, that's Jehovah. Verse 14, bid morn change earth as clay beneath the seal. Bid dawn enrobe the beauteous world with light. So is it Job who bid morn to change the earth as clay beneath the seal? Well, of course, if the earth is wetted with dew, it becomes soft. But then when the sun rises and dries it up, then the clay hardens in the daylight. So he says it's just like clay beneath the seal. When you seal something and it hardens, well, that's what happens with the earth. As the sunlight shines upon it, it hardens it, dries it out. And then bid dawn enrobe the beauteous world with light. So he says dawn gives the world light like a robe. So very, very poetic, very picturesque there. He says, are you the one who enrobes the earth with light in the daytime? Of course, Job isn't. Verse 15, thus morning robs the wicked of their prey and stays arrested the uplifted arm. So this is going back to the idea that the wicked do their wicked deeds at night. And he says, morning robs the wicked of their prey. Of course, at night the prey is walking along. He can't see the wicked coming because it's dark. But then dawn comes and the daylight shines and he can see them. Oh, there they are, and he can run. So morning robs the wicked of their prey that they could have gotten at night. And the uplifted arm, uplifted to do some kind of wickedness, suddenly the light shines upon it and reveals it. And suddenly he turns and runs. He doesn't want anybody to see his arm uplifted to do evil things. Verse 16, the fountains of the sea hast thou explored, or hast thou searched the secrets of the deep? So these are the fountains or the springs in the sea. And modern science didn't even know there were springs in the sea until relatively recently, when he discovered the springs at the bottom of the sea, at the bottom of the ocean, that provide water into the ocean. Or have you searched the secrets of the deep? The deep is that which is under the surface of the water. Have you gone down and searched out everything that's down there, far under the water? Well, of course Job hadn't. Verse 17, the gates of death, have they been shown to thee? Or hast thou seen the portals of its shade? The gates of death. Now, of course, this is poetic. Death doesn't really have gates, but the gate would be the way into death, the entrance. And through resurrection, of course, also the exit. Resurrection is the exit. Death is the entrance into death. Dying is the entrance into death. Resurrection is the exit from it. But he describes this poetically as a gate. Now, of course, in reality, death is something we can't see beyond. We can see ourselves going toward death. We can see death when it comes. There's my dead loved one there. We can't see beyond it. But for him, that's no problem. He sees the death that we're heading toward. He sees the death, and then he sees resurrection. He sees the way in and the way out. And he is the one who died and conquered death from the inside. Our Lord Jehovah, Jesus Christ, he died and conquered death from the inside. So he knows death inside and out. And it's not mysterious to him. Verse 18, the utmost breadths of earth hast thou surveyed? Reply, if thou hast knowledge of it all. So he asks Job, have you surveyed the most remote parts of the earth? Or again, it's air, it could be land. Have you been to every corner of the land? Have you seen north, south, east, and west? Just everywhere there is to look? Well, no, of course Job hadn't. None of us have seen the utmost breadths of the land, every last corner of it. He says, reply if thou hast knowledge of it all. He says, I know it all. Do you? Do you? And of course Job didn't. Verse 19, where lies the way that leads to light's abode? And as for darkness, where is found its place? So he says, where lies the way that leads to light's abode? Its home, its dwelling place. Now today we have a name for the dwelling place of light. We call it the electromagnetic spectrum. But do we really understand it? Could we get there? Well, God understands the electromagnetic spectrum. He made it. He knows light's abode. He knows it from the inside. He made the thing. And as for darkness, where is found its place? He knows darkness. He made that as well. We use darkness often symbolic for evil, but really God is the creator of darkness and he's its ruler. We call some evil ruler a dark lord. Well, the real lord of darkness is Jehovah. He made it. He knows it. Of course, he made it initially for rest and peace. Now fallen humanity uses it for chaos and destruction. But he knows the proper place of darkness, and it's for rest and peace. Verse 20, that thou shouldst bring each to its proper bound, and know the paths that lead unto its house. You say, do you know where light dwells and where darkness dwells, so you can put each into its place? See, light goes here or darkness here. Do you know how to do that? Because, of course, Jehovah knows how to do that. Does he know the paths to the house of light and darkness? To the place where they both can be found? Well, of course, even modern science struggles with this. We know the electromagnetic spectrum, but what exactly is it? For a long time there was this debate about light. Is it particles of something moving through space? Or is it a wave moving through some invisible field? And then they made experiments where they found those photons of light, those photons that move through space. And they said, aha, we figured it out. It's particles of something moving through space. And so for a long time, science thought it was particles, until some scientist came along and said, wait a minute, I'm not so sure about this. And he was able to calculate light's wavelength. So now science knows that light has photons, particles moving through space, and yet it's also waves, a wave moving through something else. Now logically, that doesn't really make any sense. Something could even be a particle of something moving through space, or also a wave moving through something else, but it can't be both at the same time, and yet light is that somehow. So modern science, we know so much, we know about light. Well, no, we don't. Understand something that's photons and waves at the same time. Understand that. Just try. Just try. Yet God knows all about it. He understands it. It all makes sense to him. Verse 21, thou knowest, of course. Thou must have then been born, and great must be the number of thy days. Of course, he's speaking that figure irony again. We call it sarcasm. Job, since you're so wise, you could argue with me and win. Well, you must have been there when I made these things. You must know all about this stuff. So tell me all your knowledge of these things, Job. Show that you're as smart as I am. You could argue with me and win. Verse 22, the treasuries of snow hast thou approached? Or hast thou seen the storehouse of the hail? The treasuries of snow. Well, again, remember, Job is poetry. It's not meant to be a scientific textbook. It's poetry. And we know something now about how snow forms in the clouds. How it solidifies, crystallizes into these snowflakes. And the hail, we know how it's blown around there in the clouds. Well, it grows bigger and bigger and bigger until it finally gets heavy enough it falls, depending on how much updraft there is, how long it keeps forming there. It gets bigger and bigger. Of course, the stronger the updraft, the bigger it'll be before it falls. So we kind of know about these things, but can we enter these storehouses and watch this happening? God can. God can. Verse 23. Which against the time of trouble I have kept, against the day of battle and of war. So Jehovah says that he can store up hail to use in a day of battle. And he can. In fact, we read about him doing just such a thing in Joshua chapter 10 and verse 11. And this is back when, of course, the Lord was fighting with Israel to give them the promised land and defeat and destroy the Canaanites out of the promised land. And in Joshua 10 and verse 11, we read, and it came to pass, as they fled from before Israel, and this was the Amorites that Israel was fighting at this time, and were in the going down to Beth Horon, that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them unto Azekah, and they died. They were more which died with hailstones than they whom the children of Israel slew with the sword. So as the Amorites were fleeing and going down to Beth Horon, descending this hill, Jehovah took and cast huge stones, huge hailstones down on them that killed more of them than the Israelites had killed. So he had stored up these hailstones to use to help his army against their enemies. Now, Job was probably written before Joshua, and yet Jehovah knew that he could store up hail for things like this. He didn't have to have had it already happen to know this. Verse 24. The light, by what way do its rays break up? How drives the east wind o'er the earth its course? So he says the light. By what way do its rays break up? And this would be breaking apart like a prism. You take a prism and you can break the rays of light apart and see the different rays. That's what a prism does. So he says, Job, can you break up the rays of light like a prism does and talk about each different ray and its characteristics? Or he says, do you know how the east wind drives the course over the earth? Of course, we know something of winds and how they move and why they move. And there are things like differences in temperature and differences in pressure, and it causes the wind to move in a certain way. Yeah, we know these things, but do we know all about it? Do we know exactly what drives the east wind or any wind? Do we know these things? Well, not like Jehovah, the maker of these things, knows them. He knows every detail. Of course, we show how little we know. We try to explain exactly what the weather is going to be, and then we're often just out to lunch. Verse 25, who cleft a channel for the floods of rain, or passage for the sudden thunder flash? So who cleft, who divided out that channel for the rain to flow down? And of course, rain flows down channels. That's always the thing. These scientists will say that the river formed that canyon, or the river formed that huge river valley. Well, no, maybe a huge valley was there, and that's why the river flows there, because it's a valley. But the fact is, the Lord is the one who delved the channels for the rain. And what about the passage of the lightning? Of course, the sudden thunder flash, a thunder flash is the lightning. The lightning flashes and causes the thunder. So who figured out the passage for the lightning to follow? Well, that was the Lord. He figures out the rules and the way for lightning to travel. And we didn't figure those things out. Verse 26, so that it rains on lands where no one dwells, on wilderness where no man hath his home. No land is Eretz, again, of course, and no Ish, no person dwells there. And the wilderness where no Adam, that time it's Adam, meaning any member of Adam's race, of course, man or woman, has his home there. So there are lands where no Ish and no Adam, no human being at all lives or dwells or even is at that time. And yet even in those uninhabited places, the rain still falls. God still waters it. God still causes the plants to grow. He still causes the animals to flourish. So Jehovah knows all lands. Now, of course, back when Job was written, the population was much smaller, and there were probably a lot more lands where people didn't live. But there are still huge plots of land, big deserts, huge jungles. I mean, even the forest Everglades in Florida. I mean, nobody lives in many places in the Everglades in Florida. So there are plenty of uninhabited places where people don't go, places where people have never been. And yet it still rains in those places. God still takes care of the whole system. And we don't need to be there to order it. We don't even need to be there to see it, to know it. Jehovah causes it to happen. Verse 27, to saturate the wild and thirsty waste, and cause the meadow's tender herb to shoot. So even the wild waste and even the uninhabited meadows, he still waters. He still gives rain to maintain them, and he still causes the plants to grow there, even if we're not there to benefit from them. So certainly, it's not us, it's not the human race that's causing rain to happen and causing plants to grow. Verse 27, the rain, hath it a father beside me? The drops of dew, who hath begotten them? So does rain have a father besides Jehovah? No, of course not. Jehovah is the only father the rain has. He made it. What about the dew? Did anyone else bring forth the dew but Jehovah? No, of course not. Verse 29, whose is the womb whence cometh forth the ice, and heaven's hoarfrost? Who gave it its birth? So whose womb brings forth the ice? And of course it's Jehovah's womb. And we see here that Jehovah is not afraid to picture himself, poetically of course, by female figures like a womb. Well, of course, Jehovah is the creator of both the male and the female, both men and women. And God is not a man. He just created men. And God is not a woman, but he created women. And every good aspect of men and women found its original in God, because he poured some of his good aspects into both the male and the female. So he's not afraid to use feminine figures for himself. Now in the Bible, he's usually pictured as male. And I think that's because, of course, he's the God of our salvation. Remember, Adam is the one that God sent to be the king of the earth, to rule over the earth and bring it into order. And he gave the woman to be his helpmeet. And if God would picture himself as a woman, and if God would picture Jesus Christ as a woman, why the figure would be that God is our helper to help us save ourselves. But he pictures himself as a man. He is the one who is our salvation. He's not just a helper to help us be saved. He is our salvation. And that's why he had to be a man, had to come to earth as a man and not as a woman. But really, the ultimate good in both male and female comes from him. He's the personification of both. So he's not afraid at times to use a female figure for himself like a womb. He says it's Jehovah's womb that brings forth the ice. And heaven's hoarfrost, the frozen frost, why, he gave it its birth. He brought it forth. He was pregnant with it and brought it forth. Verse 30, as turned to stone, the waters hide themselves. The surface of the deep, congealed, coheres. So, of course, this is describing poetically the freezing over of the lakes. The waters turn to stone and are hidden underneath the ice. Of course, God made it that way. Most things become heavier when they turn to a solid. Ice becomes lighter and floats to the top. Otherwise, the whole lake would freeze from the bottom up and nothing could live in it. But the ice freezes on top and forms a cap and protects the water below so it doesn't freeze. But it turns the waters to stone and hides the surface of the deep, of the water underneath. And he's the one who caused it to do that. In many ways, life on earth would be impossible if ice sunk in water rather than floating. But he's the one who made it to float. Verse 31, canst thou bind fast the cluster Pleiades, or canst thou loosen great Orion's bands? Now these are the constellations. And E.W. Bullinger, in his book on the Witness of the Stars, argued that the constellations, though they've since been corrupted, were originally created by God, and that they give a biblical type message in the constellations. But that since then, and since the writing of the Bible, God protects the Bible as his word, and didn't protect the constellations anymore, and they fell into corruption, and their meanings were corrupted. Well, it's an interesting idea. I know Sellers, the founder of the Word of Truth Ministry, scoffed at it. I don't insist on it by any means. I don't know that I scoff at it quite like he did. It's an interesting idea, but I'm certainly not going to insist on it. But it is very interesting that God mentions some of the constellations. And he didn't seem to consider them superstition or his enemy when he mentioned them. So he asked, can you bind fast the cluster Pleiades, or canst thou loose great Orion's bands? And of course, he couldn't. He couldn't. Verse 32, canst thou lead forth the zodiac's monthly signs, or canst thou guide Arcturus and his sons? Can you lead forth zodiac's monthly signs? And Hebrew there is Mazaroth. And Mazaroth does indeed, I think, speak of the 12 signs of the zodiac. Now, what are the 12 signs of the zodiac? Well, as the sun moves through the sky from the beginning of the year to the end, it moves one by one through a series of 12 constellations as it moves through the sky. Of course, we know the sun moves from summer to winter back and forth. And it moves through these constellations. And there are 12 in a circle, 12 constellations. And each one has a main and then two others that are connected with it. So there's 3 in each sign of the zodiac. And they mark the sun's path through the sky from summer to winter. And each month is associated with 3 of the constellations. So Arcturus and his sons, can you guide them? Of course, that was another constellation. Verse 33, the statutes of the heavens, knowest thou these? Didst thou set their dominion o'er the earth? Did you, Job, set the statutes? In other words, the rules that the heaven follow? And, of course, the heavens, we know mathematical precision in the way the stars move, in the way the planets move. You can calculate exactly. None of them deviate. Of course, other than the planets. The planets are so close to us that they move in what seemed like odd paths to the ancient astronomers. So they called the planets wandering stars. They didn't understand that they were different than the other stars. They weren't stars at all, they were planets. But even they follow a mathematical order if we look at them right, if we understand their orbit around the sun. But the stars move with this mathematical precision. And the ancients would calculate it out and marvel at this precision of the stars. And he says, are you the one who set the rules and set all this mathematical precision in motion, Job? Did you set the dominion of the rules of the heavens over the earth? Of course, the heaven has dominion. For example, in the sun, that causes light and heat and really life. The moon that causes the tides. The stars that mark the passing of signs, and so forth. He said, did you cause this authority of the heavens over the earth, Job? Verse 34, the clouds, canst thou to them lift up thy voice, that plenteousness of rain may cover thee? So he says, can you, Job, command the clouds to dump rain on you? Can you do that? Well, of course Job couldn't. Of course Job couldn't tell the clouds to rain on him. Only Jehovah could do that. Verse 35, canst thou send lightnings forth, that they may go and say to thee, behold us, here are we? So he says, can you send lightnings out? Can you send them where you want them to go? In fact, do they obey your command? Do they say, behold us, here we are. Give us your command, we'll do it. Well, of course, lightning didn't answer to Job. Lightning only answers to Jehovah. Verse 36, who hath put wisdom in the inward parts, or understanding given to the heart? Now here's an interesting transition. We go from the wonders of nature to the wonders in us. Who gave us wisdom? Who caused us to understand? Who put wisdom in the inner parts? Now, inner parts is a Hebrew word that occurs only here in Psalm 51 and verse 6. When David was writing a psalm after he had submitted to God after his great sin with Bathsheba, after the prophet Nathan condemned him of it. And he wrote Psalm 51:6, behold, thou desirest truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part thou shalt make me to know wisdom. And he did, like Job said, or like Jehovah says here in Job. He's the one who put wisdom in the inward parts, or understanding given to the heart, the inner being of the human beings, where all our motivations and the reason we do things come from. He put understanding there. Verse 37, who by his wisdom piles the clouds in tiers? Or who inclines the rain clouds of the skies? So who uses his wisdom to decide where do the cumulus clouds go and where do the cirrus clouds go and all these different clouds? Who decides where they go and what height and puts them all in their place? Who does that? Nobody but Jehovah could do that. Or who inclines the rain clouds of the skies? Who puts the rain clouds in their place so that they'll rain on the right places on earth? Verse 38, when dust like metal fused becomes hard, and clods cleave fast together solidly. So dust, and this is like in Genesis 2 and verse 7 where it says the Lord made Adam of the dust of the ground. And really the word means soil, the topsoil. He made Adam of the topsoil of the ground, not this dry dust, but the topsoil of the ground. Well, the topsoil, when it doesn't rain, it fuses together. It becomes hard. It needs water soaking through it to soften it. And the clouds of earth, they cleave, they stick together solidly when it hasn't rained. And yet who then inclines the rain clouds to go over them and rain? Well, no one but Jehovah. Well, in this portion, we see Jehovah speaks to Job out of the storm. And he doesn't attempt to answer Job's accusations, but he rather asks him a series of questions. And he shows Job that he is the one who made the earth. He is the one who made the sea. He is the one who made the sun and causes it to move. He controls death and light and snow and hail, rain, the stars, the clouds, the lightning. Can Job control these? Does he know where they come from and how they work? Does he know how they're made? Well, of course not. So Jehovah here speaks and shows Job that he's been thinking of God as being far too small to even think that he could argue with God and out-argue him. But I'll tell you what, Job is not the only one. Don't we often make God far too small the same way? Well, let's learn from Job, and let's learn just how big our mighty God is. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our teaching today. If you have, please press like below. Comment, if you will. These things help promote our videos. And until we gather again around the pages of God's book, I bid you goodbye.